I have been interested in nuclear war since I was a child during this period, and I was often very frightened by the threat of nuclear war, and this led me to writing two books actually about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first one was the one that my PowerPoint was based on, Awaiting Armageddon, which is about how ordinary Americans experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis and what they expected would come from the Cuban Missile Crisis or from nuclear war in general. And it was a subject of science fiction that was very frightening to people. And I can remember worrying about the start of nuclear war. And I also remember hurrying home from school to see President Kennedy's news conferences so that I would have some confidence that the world was right. So that is what led me into writing this book. And what I found was that just as I have memories of that period, when I would mention it to other people, each person had a memory of that period and wanted to talk about uh, how frightening it was to think that nuclear war could start at any minute. So I did a lot of research at the Kennedy Library, but I also did interviews that I basically put an ad in a publication asking people if they had memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then I drew from their memories to pull together a book about that side of the crisis, which I didn't think anyone else had covered.
Uh, Alice, uh, the methods, the methods about oral history, about the research with community, with common people. What is your experience in this area of research, historical research?
Okay. I had I took a course in oral history so that I would learn how to ask the right questions. And as I say, I placed an ad, and some people emailed me and said they were interested in talking about it. And I set up a time to call them, and uh, it was very interesting. Many of the people who wanted to talk about it were either they were in a religious role. They had been a priest or a nun or a minister, and they had very specific memories of uh, exactly what happened to them. One woman remembered that she was a nun and was in her first year as a nun, and they were supposed to be kept closeted, but they were brought out uh, during and I think it was during the missile crisis. I may be wrong. It may have been during JFK's assassination, but at some point they were brought out of their closeted state so that they could be involved in what was going on in the news. Um, so I talked to most of these people for 30 minutes to an hour, and they just described to me what it was like. Most of them were quite young when the missile crisis happened.
And the ethnic factor in this ethnic factor, black American, white American, no, the ethnic factor in this situation, in this, no,
In the missile crisis, I don't think that race was a big issue. I do think it was an issue for Cubans who were in the United States or Cuban Americans. Um, I think most people experienced the crisis pretty much the same way because this was one case in which even if you were rich, and why it didn't mean you were going to be saved from nuclear war. You were just as vulnerable as, a poor black family. Um, I suspect there were cases, I mean, some rich people did, in fact, have their own fallout shelters, which gave them more protection. But in general, I went through, I did go to the Martin Luther King Library and went through his papers and did not find a whole lot, from him about this period or anything special that happened to him during this period. He was a pacifist and, was opposed to war of any kind. But I think he experienced the crisis just pretty much like everybody else.
And the impact of stress, the Cold War, the possibility and atomic and nuclear war, the impact in relationship between men, women, the love in nuclear war, the love in a possibility of nuclear war, more children, less children.
Right. If a nuclear war had happened, children, there would have been a lot of birth defects in the areas that were affected by the fallout. So there would have been fewer children, and this because the crisis became in some ways sort of child focused, because even JFK in the White House was talking about how the one thing he couldn't stand was the thought of children dying. And I think that in the long run, the crisis affected those people who were children at that time, because they felt that the adults of the world were going to start a war and wipe them out. And these are the same people who 5 years later were protesting the Vietnam War and had a generation gap with their parents. So, I think it had different effects depending on where you were in terms of age. Some adults were able to go through the crisis and just do their jobs and not think about it. My school, where I was, they were getting ready to send us home so we could die with our mothers. So that was very frightening. And that was something that my mother, in fact, didn't even know anything was going on that day, but it was terrifying to the children. And that was not a unique circumstance. That happened in other schools too, across the country.
The comparison between California and New York, the Californians, the attitude of New Yorkers in front of the possibility of nuclear war.
Well, that was interesting because New York was much more vulnerable, but just because of geographically it was closer to Cuba. And New York did, call all the firemen and the policemen into work, cancel all the vacations, um, and they did all the right things to prepare. They didn't have fallout shelters for people. They had shelters, but they didn't have them stocked with food or anything like that. But New York, in a way, reacted much more calmly than Los Angeles did, because there were actually runs on the supermarkets in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles was right on the very. They were only a little bit vulnerable to the missiles in Cuba because they were so far away from Cuba. But they actually cleared the shelves in supermarkets and just canned goods. They took all the canned goods, they guns, all kinds of things that rushed out to get because they thought nuclear war was going to start. And actually, probably the most interesting reaction in a specific place was in Miami, where uh, the man who was the top official for the county told people to go out and buy a 2 week supply of food. So of course that panicked people because here they had an official telling them that nuclear war might be starting and that they should rush out and do that. So that particular man got a lot of flack because the Kennedy administration was trying to have all the officials keep everyone calm.
And the consequence the possibility of nuclear war in the rights, American rights, the sector politicals or some rights American, not the nationality
Mhm.
American, the nationalist American, the white rights American. They are more strong. The state is far the people, the common people, and the common people must organize themselves. The impact in the local politics, the possibility of nuclear war.
Okay. It varied very much from city to city in terms of how they handled the population, and it was very erratic. In some cities, there was a lot of panic, and there were a lot of people who were very upset. In Philadelphia, the African American newspaper had a headline. I think it was a weekly. It is a weekly newspaper, and so they had one paper come out during the crisis, and the headline was something to the effect of, how many people could die in Philadelphia, and most of them would be black because there were more blacks towards the center of the city than there were whites. And of course, you don't know whether if the Soviet Union had been aiming missiles at Philadelphia, whether they would have aimed for City Hall or whether they would have aimed for some other location. But uh, there was a feeling, that within big cities that there was some concern about in different neighborhoods that they felt more vulnerable than others did.
Uh,
But I think that, if nuclear war had happened, they would have instituted martial law, and so all of our rights would probably have been gone because uh, they would have had to do that if the country was devastated.
Alice, in the in another topic of the conference, in the first part is Peter Lim. We talk about some books in this year, in this time. For example, what is your opinion? What is your advice? The book of Philip Shandon, about the Harley Lee Oswald in Mexico. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
I'm not sure I can't hear you exactly.
What is your advice? What is your opinion about a book of Philip Shannon. Philip Shannon write a book about the death of GF, GFK, about the Lee Oswald in Mexico, Lee Oswald in Cuba, and the relationship within FBI, CIA, and Lee Oswald. What is your no?
About the assassination?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Um, I I personally believe that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy, but um, I do believe, that there is a chance that there was some sort of conspiracy behind him, but I think he's the human being that pulled the trigger. Um, and I think, given that it's been 50 years, probably a conspiracy would have come to light by now, but there's no way of knowing. There certainly the Warren Commission did not do a good job of investigating the assassination, so that left the door open for people to have a lot of suspicions about what really happened.
Um, what is the in your experience the reason, the interest in President Kennedy? What is the start of politics? What is the interest in 21st century in President Kennedy?
That's a very good question, and I do have a good answer, I think. Even when President Kennedy was alive, he was the most popular president since the Gallup polls started keeping track of how people judged presidents. They started doing that when Franklin Roosevelt was president, and from Roosevelt through Obama, there hasn't been a single president who was as popular while he was alive and in office as Kennedy was. He was young, handsome, energetic, and I really feel that he grew into the role of president, that his last year, some really fantastic things happened. Uh, he declared that we could have peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, which nobody else would even talk about before. He also introduced the strongest civil rights legislation since the American Civil War. So I really felt that he was coming into his own. And I also think we can't underestimate the fact that he had a beautiful wife. He was beautiful. His children were beautiful. And people remember that. And that sticks with them more than most things like foreign policy sticks with people. People remember the family, and they were glamorous. So even people who are not old enough to remember the Kennedy administration are fascinated by this beautiful family and by the mystery surrounding his death. I talked to a young woman who said that when she died and went to heaven, the first thing she was going to ask when she got to heaven was, who killed JFK? And I thought that was pretty amazing. She wasn't even old enough she was born after it happened. And I said, why is that such a mystery to you? And she said, it just is. It's so compelling. And she said, I can't stand the fact that we don't know for sure. And I just really want to know. And I think that's part of his longevity in terms of the public attitudes, is that later generations do know enough about him to be interested in him. And you know he did a lot of things that he's remembered around the world for different things. He did the Alliance for Progress in Latin America. He gave that great speech in Berlin about the Berlin Wall, and his eloquence has lived after him. And I think that while he was not the best president in terms of getting legislation through Congress, he was amazing in terms of inspiring people. And I think is something that has lasted beyond his life by 50 years now.
Um, in your experience, what is the ethnic factor? We can compare Obama, Barack, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, Obama Barack, exit factor, American Black, Irish American, Catholic American. What is the relationship in this topic? Ethnic, politics, and president.
I think it's a very interesting question. The Kennedys, because they were Catholic and because they were Irish, were not considered to be well, other people in the United States who were wealthy looked down on them because they were Irish and they were Catholic. Although I doubt, I think that John F. Kennedy's father probably felt that much more than he did. He probably, he had people question his Catholicism, and when he ran for president, he just faced it head on. He went to a meeting of ministers who were opposed to him because he was Catholic, and he answered their questions. And their questions were things like, will you be taking orders from the Pope? And he said, no, I'll be the one making all the decisions. And I think he was a little bit shocked that they thought that. And I think Obama has it's interesting because while there were people who were willing to come right out and say, I'm not going to vote for a Catholic, there are very few people in the United States right now who say out loud, I'm not going to vote for a black man. There probably are plenty of people who think that way, but it's not something that's said out loud anymore. It's just not politically correct. And I am personally proud of the United States for having elected a black man. I feel that Obama has gone out of his way not to be uh, overly connected to the black community, just as Kennedy tried not to be overly connected to the Catholic Church. But both of them were relatively young. Uh, Obama has now had uh, not quite twice as much time in office as Kennedy did, but he's moving towards that point. Um, One of the things that I think is so impressive about Kennedy and that I think works to his benefit in terms of the way people remember him is he was president for such a short time. And so what he accomplished is impressive for that time period. And it makes it hard for the people who followed him as president to compete with that. And one of the things about being in office longer is you have more chances to make mistakes and to get into trouble over various things. And so now Obama is struggling with the fact that his healthcare system is not working the way he planned for it to work. When Lyndon Johnson followed Kennedy, his first year was great, but when he got to his fourth or fifth year, he got to be the whole Vietnam mess and everything. And it's hard to compete with someone who died before he had been president long enough that he sort of had the inevitable problems. Um, so I think, and I also do think that Obama is probably not as good as Kennedy, but close to Kennedy in terms of the quality of his speeches. He does, I think, uh, Americans do respond to good speeches, and they don't hear them very often. So,
Alice, in the Obama Barack campaign, there are Hillary Clinton, Obama Barack. In this moment, Ted Kennedy, Ted Kennedy shows Obama Barack in 20th
right.
century. In this context, the the, the power, Kennedy family, the financial power, the political powers In this year, a Kennedy is an American ambassador in Japan. No,
That's right.
the idea is the Kennedy family is more John F. Kennedy. No? The idea is the family Kennedy, the financial power, the power politics.
Yes, the Kennedy family has and continues to be a family operation, really. That there's never been a sense of a Kennedy who was standing alone. And I thought it was interesting in 2008 that Ted Kennedy chose to give his support to Obama over Hillary Clinton. Um, and I don't know exactly why that was, but I think he saw something in Obama that reminded him of the kind of liberal politician that he was, and that his brothers both were. And so he saw that in him and gave his support. The Kennedy family, who knows how many generations will have Kennedys in office. I think that Caroline Kennedy probably will be an excellent ambassador. Of course, several of Robert Kennedy's sons and daughters, at least one of his daughters, have been in politics. So they apparently are raised with a certain sense of obligation, or at least a sense that this is the kind of career that they might do well in.
Alice, all people knew the relationship United States, Union Soviet, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Khrushchev, Kennedy. Khrushchev felt really bad for death of President Kennedy. But China, what is the relationship Kennedy and China? Kennedy, no, communist China. This is, we can talk about this relationship. In this moment,
You
China
know,
is very next to America, no?
that was a period in which China and the United States were pretty cut off from each other in terms of no direct communication. And so Kennedy worried a lot about China. Particularly like in Laos, there was a big issue whether Laos was going to be communist or capitalist, and they ultimately decided they reached a deal that it would be a neutral country. But that was seen as a spot where the Chinese might move in. And I think Kennedy did believe in the domino theory, which is what got Johnson into trouble in Vietnam, was the idea that if one country fell to communism, that all the neighbors would fall too. And Kennedy, that's why we had troops in Vietnam to begin with, was because Eisenhower was worried about the possibility that one country might become communist. And Kennedy believed that too, and he did increase the number of troops that were there, although nothing compared to what Johnson later did. But I think China was a mystery. I mean, it was a scary mystery, a big, powerful country that we didn't really talk to. And so we had a lot of stereotypes about the Soviet Union and what we expected from them, which was all bad. But with China, it was a little bit scarier because we didn't know what to expect. And the United States at that point was still had a close relationship with Chiang Kai-shek in his little nationalist China, and really didn't know what to expect from Mao.
And the shadow of Kennedy is over Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson changed America. Johnson create opportunity to Black America. And the history is very bad with Johnson. The history is very good for Kennedy. What is your experience, Johnson and Kennedy?
I think Johnson is really a tragic figure because I think he was a good man who did accomplish a lot. He got the 1964 Civil Rights Bill passed. It was a much stronger bill than the one that Kennedy proposed in 63. And Kennedy would have had trouble getting that bill through Congress. But Johnson knew how to work Congress. He got that bill through, he got the voting rights bill through, he got Medicare. He did a lot in his war on poverty for poor people across the country. And it's sad, but partially people couldn't deal with the fact that he wasn't Kennedy. And so they didn't really appreciate what he accomplished. And then when things went wrong in Vietnam, that was pretty much all they remembered about Johnson. I, I know Johnson at one point during the war on poverty, he went into to a poor coal mining town in Appalachia where they didn't have any pictures on the wall except one of Jesus Christ and one of John F. Kennedy. And Johnson's reaction was that he said he felt like he'd been slapped in the face because he had done so much for the poor. And yet there was this pretty picture of Kennedy on the wall. And I think there was just no escaping that for him. I think in a way he was sort of doomed from the start because he couldn't compete with the memory of Kennedy. And he was just so different. It wasn't that he was bad, but it was just, Kennedy's Boston accent, Johnson's Texas accent. Kennedy was very sophisticated, wouldn't wear, if somebody wanted to wear a funny hat, he wouldn't wear it. Johnson would do almost anything. Johnson, picked up his dogs by their ears, and he thought it was fun. But a lot of people thought, well, he's an awful person because he even mistreats his dogs. It was just like he couldn't do anything right.
Um, Kennedy was Democrats. What is the Republican Kennedy? Ronald Reagan. Kennedy was Democratic Party. What is the
Mm-hmm.
which is the Kennedy Republican? Ronald Reagan. I don't know. In your what is the Kennedy of Republican Party?
Well, I think it's that's a difficult question because the Republican Party has moved so far to the right that they're so identified with being to the right that it's kind of hard to compare them with Kennedy. But I think in terms of personality and charisma and impact on people, uh, Ronald Reagan, movie star, he was totally different in politics, but he could make people feel good about themselves and make them feel good about the country. So I think that's probably a fairly good in terms of style, not in terms of substance. That's Reagan comes close to that. Um, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the beginning of the 20th century, was like Kennedy, very young. He was 42 when he became president, and he was a Republican, but he was very much a progressive. He cared about what happened to the poor. Like Kennedy, he was a rich man who became president and then learned what it was like for other people not to have all the things that he had had growing up. But right now, I can tell you, I don't see any Republicans who seem like Kennedys to me.
Alice, in your experience about Kennedy, what is the new idea? What is the new facts we can talk about this president in this moment, in 21st century? there are 40,000 books about Kennedy, but what is
Right.
the new image of Kennedy in this time, this moment?
I think the big change in terms of how Kennedy has been viewed is that as we have gotten to hear the tapes that Kennedy made of various meetings in the White House, particularly during the missile crisis, but at other times too, that he comes across as being much more careful and thoughtful than he did in his speeches at the time. You know, if he was challenging Khrushchev, he talked tough. You know, he would say, "We're going to go to war over this." You know, if they don't back off. But in reality, what we know now is that he was a whole lot more interested in being careful, but he did it in private. He did it behind closed doors in the White House, and he had the loyalty of the people around him so that they didn't tell, for instance, that he ended the missile crisis by making a secret deal with Khrushchev to take missiles out of Turkey and Italy, US missiles. He did that, and that was a secret for more than 20 years, which is pretty hard to imagine nowadays whenever nobody has secrets anymore. And I think while some people, really strong anti-communists might think, oh, he was a sissy, he didn't take as tough a stand as it looked like, he compromised. I think most people look back on that and think, oh, good, he wasn't risking our lives to, to make a point. He was trying to be careful. He was not reckless. That was one of the things in the 1970s when historians started to say negative things about Kennedy. The word that came up a lot was reckless. And I think we know now that he wasn't reckless. He was actually very careful. And I think that gives a sense of added maturity to his presidency.
Um, Alice, do you believe President Kennedy is long life in 21st century? What is the legacy of President Kennedy for American politics, for American presidential? The legacy of American for American politics.
I think part of his legacy, and this is not what he intended, but his his use of television and his understanding of how important images were is clearly something that shaped the American presidency since then. Presidents have had to give live news conferences, and they've had to uh, be in front of TV cameras almost all the time. Um, I also think he had a bottom line in terms of foreign policy, which the bottom line was, we'll do everything up to the point of we're not going to go to war. And I do think, I mean, a lot of historians, and there have actually been books written about Kennedy in Vietnam, which have said he would never have gotten tangled up in Vietnam. And I think that's probably true. And I think that kind of cautiousness is a good thing, and it's a good thing to be in the memories of presidents. We tend to stumble into wars, and then we don't know how we got there, and we need politicians who are more careful about every little step along the way so that we don't stumble into a war. And I think, one of the things that, and this was something else that really bothered Johnson, was that because Kennedy in 1963 made a speech and said it's immoral that the South has segregated schools. It's immoral that black children, can't go to the same swimming pools as white children. It's immoral that they can't eat in the same restaurants or go to the same hotels. And that is something he's really remembered in the black community for. Even though Johnson's the one who actually got the legislation passed, Kennedy was the one who first stepped up and said, this is just wrong. It's not a political question. It's just right or wrong. He knew he was going to lose the support of all the Southern Democrats, but he said it anyway. And I think that's a great legacy. And I think that's part of why the Democratic Party still gets so many votes from African Americans, is because they attach that memory to him.
Yeah. Alice, I would like to some student to ask you. Eh, alguno, alguna pregunta. Yo le traduzco una pregunta. Está Alice. ¿Qué puedes decir?
Yeah.
Student Alice, wait, wait. Aquí la
Looks like some.
My name is Santiago Agüero. I have a
aquí,
question.
aquí.
I have a
¿Cuál,
question.
cuál?
What was the relation between the Center of American Intelligence and the death of Kennedy? And what was the relation between Lyndon Johnson and the Center of American Intelligence in the Kennedy death? Thank you.
Are you asking about the relationship between President Johnson and President Kennedy?
The relationship between CIA and death of Kennedy. This is a no. This is a
Oh, the
yeah.
CIA and the death of Kennedy.
Oliver
Well,
Oliver Stone.
I don't think there's any proof that the CIA had anything to do with it. I think that was a period when the CIA was very powerful, and Kennedy did fire the head of the CIA after the Bay of Pigs invasion was such a failure.
Yeah.
And just stay in touch.
Yes. Bye, Alice. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.